Now, it's deadline day for the Cabinet Office following a demand by the COVID inquiry for the government to hand over Boris Johnson's diaries, notebooks and WhatsApp messages from the pandemic. Well, yesterday, Mr Johnson urged the Cabinet Office to disclose the contents in full, but the government argues that it should withhold irrelevant material. Well, the inquiry set the Cabinet Office a deadline of 4 p.m. today to comply. So what's that, just under an hour and a half's time? Well, Dr Catherine Haddon is Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and joins me now from Westminster. Very good afternoon to you. The big question today, then, is whether the Cabinet Office is likely to hand over this material, these WhatsApp messages and these diaries, to the inquiry by 4 p.m. today. Are they likely to change their position, in your view?
I honestly don't know. I mean, common sense, my gut instinct is they have to. There's not really a good excuse for them. And most of the legal experts I've spoken to don't think that they would have much luck with any legal complaint. And also, it's just the appearance of it all. They already look like they are thwarting the inquiry. That's not a good look. And now Boris Johnson has said that he's very happy for them to be passed on. So there's not a lot of room for manoeuvre for them. So you don't see how they get out of not doing it. That said, they've been very strong in saying that they don't want to do that and that they might fight this. So I'm still thinking that there is a possibility that a big argument ensues. And
you say that there's no reason why they shouldn't hand them over, and yet they have argued vigorously, haven't they, that they shouldn't need to hand over information and material that they feel isn't relevant. The phrase, I think, is unambiguously irrelevant material. And they say that ministers have a right to discuss some issues in private, and there's a concern about those ministers' privacy.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is they're conflating lots of different arguments. The argument that it's irrelevant, well, that's for the inquiry to work out. And Baroness Hallett has made the argument that if it's up to other people to decide what they hand over and whether it's relevant, that sets a really bad precedent for her inquiry, because not just the government, but many private individuals could do the same. In terms of the argument about it being private advice, it is important that government has free and frank advice from advisors, but it is entirely the job of this inquiry to look into that advice and to see those private conversations. So that argument also doesn't really stack up as a defence in this case.
What do you think's behind this? Do you think this is about the government concerned that other serving ministers, the Prime Minister himself, Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor, of course, at the time, their messages might go public and cause some embarrassment?
Yeah, I think that is very much what's going on here. I think the Boris Johnson WhatsApps are being used as a sort of test case for that. And also because if they then release them, then that sets a precedent for other ones. So I do think that that's at the heart of it. I think it's also a factor that WhatsApp is a very different medium than governments in the past have dealt with. During the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq war, everything would have been either on paper, occasionally emails. So it would have been very different format. WhatsApp, we all know it's much more immediate. It can be much more informal. So, it's possible that they're concerned about the nature of the material that they're giving over. But I do think it's much more about other ministers and setting that wider precedent and what that means for the inquiry, rather than it's specifically about anything in Boris Johnson's material.
So if come 4 o'clock, the Cabinet Office still hasn't handed over the material, what does happen? Do we have a lengthy legal battle? I mean, what's your take on what the next step could be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different options, and we're gonna have to wait to hear from the Cabinet Office about what they have and haven't done, because the other option that Baroness Hallett gave them was setting out a letter as to why they've not got it. That's been undermined by Boris Johnson saying he has definitely handed them over to the Cabinet Office. But it might be that the government say that they are going to ask for a judicial review of the situation, which would be them effectively taking the inquiry to court. The alternative is that they just don't hand them over at all, and it's Baroness Hallett who is then pressing forward and using some of the other powers that she's got under the Public Inquiries Act to effectively, insist that these are brought forward, or she has the ability to use those powers to, impose fines and prison sentences can also be used under the Inquiries Act's powers. So it's a really big case. I mean, what one would hope is that they find a compromise. Either they just just hand them over, or they find some other compromise. The Cabinet Office had previously said that they would be happy to show the material, to show why they think some of it is unambiguously irrelevant. But Baroness Hallett has so far been, unwilling to take that compromise.
This is a huge inquiry, isn't it? It's going to go on for years, and it's only just beginning, and already it's running into these difficulties. How do you think this could be viewed potentially? I mean, trust in the inquiry is hugely important. How much does this affair play into that issue of trust, do you think?
It does matter a lot. I mean, I think it's really going to be detrimental to the government, because I think by showing that she's willing to go to the wall on this, Baroness Hallett is showing that she's willing to push her powers and does want this to be a very thorough inquiry. So really, all this is doing is making it look like the government have got something to hide. And if that's not the case, then this is not the right way to go about it. So that, I think, is what they need to be most concerned about. Obviously, they have passed on tens of thousands of other materials. There will be public hearings starting in a couple of weeks' time. So there's going to be lots more that happens, and lots of other twists and turns to the tale. And remember, these hearings are going to go on for the next 3 years, so well through the next general election. So yes, it is very much the early days, but it's kind of setting a tone, and there is a risk that people out there start to suspect what is going on and worry that things have been hidden from them, that the inquiry wasn't able to find out.
And to what extent? I mean, it's not the first story that we've talked about in relation to government ministers using WhatsApp. I mean, to what extent is business done via WhatsApp these days? And how does that change the parameters of what should and shouldn't stay private?
Yeah, we don't really know. And that's another reason why this inquiry is going to be massively important in telling us whether or not government has fundamentally changed how it does business. We did a report last year looking into WhatsApp, and from the interviews, we were told that there is a lot of sort of problem solving. So, if there's smaller issues, sorting out quick fixes or whatever, WhatsApp is very immediate and it's a very good way of doing business. But that most of the main business of government is still done in formal meetings or correspondence. But we know that obviously in the early days of the pandemic, lots of people were online only, couldn't see each other. And so WhatsApp probably was being used far more. And we don't know how much at the top of government it was actually the forum in which major decisions were being made. And that does pose questions, because you don't know who's on the particular chat thread. You don't know whether or not they've really had a chance to examine evidence. You don't know whether people are rushing to decisions or what's going on. We all use WhatsApp and know that it has flaws in terms of ways to communicate with each other. So it is problematic, as well as it can sometimes be helpful to government.
So interesting to know whether ministers are thinking twice about what they commit to a message these days or not, what impact that's had. Yeah. Anyway, Catherine Haddon, fascinating to get your take on it. Catherine there from the Institute for Government. Thanks very much indeed.